At the Kremlin, the seat of Russian power, the guards watch over the symbols of a glorious past. As heir to the Soviet Union, at the close of the 20th century, Russia was broke, shunned, and isolated by the victors of the Cold War. Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer and unknown on the world stage, entered the corridors of power, a move that only the finest Kremlin strategists could have orchestrated. His secret obsession? To return Russia to the heart of the global scene. The word and the sword, the hallmark of Vladimir Putin. To widespread astonishment, he would hit hard and fast. Syria, Eastern Europe, Africa, hunting grounds where Putin's brutal, opportunistic tactical strikes caught the disunited West by surprise. The new warlord could congratulate his troops. Russia was once again respected, feared, and the stuff of fantasy.
Putin's a realist. Putin's a pragmatist. But I would never say Putin's an ideologue. What I will say is, in spite of everything, Putin's a gambler, a strategic gambler. He places bets.
For the whole time that he's been at the head of the country, in various roles, he's had to deal with 5 different US presidents. 5 of them, and just one Putin. Putin has survived them all. He's the most experienced politician in Europe. He knows everything and doesn't give a fig for all their fancy talk about democratic values.
His biggest asset is that time is on his side, because he's well on the way to beating Stalin's longevity record. Foreign policy is his exoskeleton, his purpose in life. He gives body and soul for foreign policy.
As Russia's eternal autocrat, Vladimir Putin has turned foreign policy into his fatal weapon, a vector for national togetherness and renewed pride. For the past 20 years, the former Soviet colonel has strived to rebuild great Russia, an ambition risen from the ashes of a collapsed empire.
When you think about Putin and what's in his mind, you must never forget something he once said. Whoever doesn't miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Whoever wants it back has no brain. And I think that's true.
Lenin had promised a radiant future for Homo Sovieticus. But in the mausoleum on Red Square, Stalin and the fallen idols watched over a burial ground of lost illusions. Defeat was bitter.
The country was completely colonized by the Americans and their friends. They were everywhere, absolutely everywhere. In the ministries, in the banks, even at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I received memos from the US Embassy telling me what to do and say on such and such a subject. It was unbelievable.
There was a period of a few years when the West displayed hubris, arrogance, and triumphalism. They truly believed that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia had become a second-rate power which no longer counted, which posed no threat, and which would become a run-of-the-mill country that would vanish from the international political scene.
The USSR capitulated and laid down its arms, while the West laid down the rules. At the Kremlin and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the shame of defeat hung in the air along with a feeling of humiliation.
During the reunification of Germany, promises were made at the highest level. They stipulated that NATO wouldn't approach Russian borders.
Despite the promises made to Gorbachev, NATO continued its advance eastwards. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, closely followed by the Baltic states, joined the Western Bloc. Russia felt encircled and betrayed.
To Putin, this was a genuine breach of contract, and he still hasn't swallowed it today.
February 2007, the first wake-up call. Putin, who early in his term of office had sought to close ties with the West, felt betrayed. So he banged his fist on the table. Invited to a World Security Forum in Munich, it was an angry Russian president who denounced American unilateralism.
Что же такое однополярный мир? Как бы ни украшали этот термин, он в конечном итоге означает на практике только одно. Это один центр власти, один центр силы, один центр принятия решения. Это мир одного хозяина, одного суверена.
I think his speech in Munich was just a matter of stating that a line had been crossed. For the first time, Vladimir Putin expressed, in a very frank, brutal and direct way, his discontent with the West's behavior.
Мы видим все большее пренебрежение основополагающими принципами международного права. Больше того, отдельные нормы, да по сути чуть ли не вся система права одного государства, прежде всего, конечно, Соединенных Штатов, перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике, и в гуманитарной сфере навязывается другим государствам. Ну, кому это понравится? Кому это понравится?
2007 marked the return of Russia to the forefront of world affairs, but as a non-aligned, independent and autonomous entity. That speech was very badly received in the West. And when I say the West, I mainly mean the United States.
Putin's speech in Munich in 2007 was seen as a surprise statement. It was like a declaration of a new Cold War coming from Moscow.
To lead this new Cold War, the tactically minded Putin chose Sergei Lavrov as his chief strategist, a president and his minister of foreign affairs. One combative and posing for the cameras, the other at the negotiating table. A two-headed eagle with a single roadmap to give back to Russia its status of world superpower. In 2008, Vladimir Putin had the chance to prove his determination. Deaf to the warning he delivered in Munich, NATO pressed on towards Russian borders. A red line was about to be crossed. Yet, the Kremlin doctrine was unequivocal. Hands off our near abroad.
The paradox in the evaluation of Russian foreign policy was that it was based on paranoia. Because back then, NATO had embarked on talks to invite Georgia and Ukraine into its organization.
Putin viewed NATO's overtures to Georgia and Ukraine as American provocation on his own doorstep. His riposte was immediate. With latent or frozen conflicts instigated in Georgia, in the Russian-speaking provinces of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, a trap set by Moscow for Georgia and its American allies.
The Georgian crisis of 2008 and the Ukrainian crisis of 2014 bore the same hallmarks. The same people were pulling the strings, our old friends, the Americans.
The Rose Revolution in Georgia brought to power the young and pro-Western Mikhail Saakashvili. At the presidential palace, under the watchful eye of George W. Bush, the Georgian president decided to re-establish order in the provinces being stirred up by Moscow.
Saakashvili was convinced that the Americans would back him fully because the West had told him, "Don't worry, we're right behind you, and President Bush will support you."
The Georgian army expected an easy victory, but on August 7, 2008, Russian tanks entered Georgia. The trap shut tight. After two lightning strikes, Moscow recognized the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Georgia had suddenly lost 20% of its territory. It was the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union that the Russian bear had left its den.
Он считается у нас хозяином тайги. И он не собирается, и я знаю это точно, куда-то переезжать в другие климатические зоны, ему там неуютно. Но тайги он своей никому не отдаст. Я думаю, что это должно быть понятно.
It was a double message that Putin sent out to his neighbors, particularly the neighbors who were tempted by allying with or joining NATO. The first message was, see, when it comes to our local interests, we're capable of sending in troops to defend them. The second, even more important message was, and when we do that, your so-called allies, those to whom you've entrusted your security, won't step in to help you.
So you can say that Putin's achievement with the war in Georgia was a military success, but also a political one.
The next confrontation between Moscow and the West would be in Kiev, in Ukraine. Buoyed by the wave of color revolutions, in late 2013, Ukraine was preparing to sign a partnership with the European Union and NATO. But Putin refused to lose this sister nation. Historical ties were too close, so he threatened.
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
Наши западные партнеры во главе с Соединенными Штатами Америки предпочитают в своей практической политике руководствоваться не международным правом, а правом сильного. И в случае с Украиной наши западные партнеры перешли черту. Вели себя грубо, безответственно и непрофессионально.
The same concerns resurfaced and were even stronger because the Russian regime, rightly or wrongly, felt it could be subjected to the possible threat of a coup to overthrow the regime. And here, Vladimir Putin's KGB past came into full play, by which I mean the threat from outside, the threat of subversion, the threat of regime change, are things which, due to his past experience, are of great concern to the current Russian president.
Under pressure from Moscow, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych turned his back on the partnership with the European Union. This outraged part of the population, which no longer wanted to be under Russian influence. In February 2014, the Euromaidan protests climaxed with fierce clashes in Kiev, resulting in more than 100 deaths. The men in Moscow's pocket were chased from power.
For Putin, this was the red line that mustn't be crossed. A line he'd already traced in the Russia-Georgia conflict of 2008. And that warning hadn't been heeded.
Since the days of the Tsars, the port of Sebastopol in Crimea, in southern Ukraine, has been Russia's sole access to the southern seas, a crucial asset for Moscow. Through the Turkish Straits, its ships can reach the Russian naval base in Tartus, Syria, giving access to the Mediterranean and beyond.
For the Russians, this was a nightmare scenario, the possibility of the base in Sebastopol one day becoming a NATO base, were Ukraine to eventually join the organization.
Sebastopol in the hands of the US Navy, an unthinkable nightmare for the Kremlin. They would have to act fast to prevent this geostrategic disaster.
Vladimir Putin himself tells of how 3 or 4 of them around the table took the decision to annex Crimea. It wasn't a question of long-term planning, but of instant opportunism. Something of ours is badly protected. We need to shore it up as quickly as possible.
There's a Russian proverb that goes, "He who digs a ditch will fall in." And what are presented as skillful, opportunistic moves by Vladimir Putin, in fact, show his ability to turn Western traps to his geopolitical advantage.
The Kremlin presented the affair with great success, and a referendum held in Crimea resulted in an 83% yes vote for the annexation of the region to the Russian Federation. Sebastopol was saved.
Сегодня, основываясь на результатах референдума, который прошел в Крыму, опираясь на волю народа, вношу в Федеральное собрание и прошу рассмотреть конституционный закон о принятии в состав России двух новых субъектов Федерации – Республики Крым и города Севастополь.
Kiev had already swung towards the western camp when Moscow launched its double offensive. Firstly, in eastern Ukraine, in the Russian-speaking region of Donbass, war broke out. A conflict orchestrated by the men in Moscow. In the south, on the Crimean Peninsula, appearing as if by magic, hundreds of soldiers with no distinctive uniforms or insignia took control of Sebastopol. A clear hallmark of Putin's strategy of disorder. He was punishing Ukraine and clearly stating that he remained the master of the near abroad. A victor's return of a triumphant emperor to Crimea.
C'est pas un plan, il faut qu'il y ait une erreur quelque part.
There was no fixed plan. He needed someone to make a mistake. A leader stepping out of line, going too far. He needed groups, minorities, to start an uprising. So he watched and waited. And I think that Georgia and Ukraine were the same. A case of Putin seizing on opportunities.
Это праздник крымчан и севастопольцев. Но это еще и праздник для всей нашей огромной страны. Именно огромной, потому что Россия остается самой большой по территории страной в мире.
This is all part of his great project, his grand design. Putin sees himself as the retriever of Russian lands, and he's clearly driven by a great historical awareness. He wants to go down in history. He wants to be the new Peter the Great.
Пожалуйста, вдохните как следует и ответьте: мы любим Россию! Поздравляю вас с праздником! Воссоединение Крыма и Севастополя с Россией. Будьте счастливы.
Crimea was a huge victory, and it was celebrated as a victory. There were parades in Moscow, a big song and dance show on Red Square, and it gave rise to a period known as the Russian Spring, a kind of wave of rather triumphalist patriotism.
International sanctions, snubbed by other nations, Russia was heavily punished for the taking of Crimea. But nobody imagined that the Kremlin boss was preparing a new offensive. On an official level, the different players were there to fight terrorism. But in fact, a bloody game of chess was about to begin in the Syrian desert.
Единственно верный путь борьбы с международным терроризмом, а в Сирии и на территории соседних стран с ней бесчинствуют именно банды международных террористов, это действовать на упреждение, бороться и уничтожать боевиков и террористов на уже захваченных ими территориях, не ждать, когда они придут в наш дом.
What with the Islamist militia, the Free Syrian Army, the Kurdish People's Defense Units, and Bashar al-Assad's forces, the war in Syria soon became incomprehensible. Western diplomacy became muddled and no longer knew who it was supporting. US President Barack Obama prevaricated, leaving the door wide open for Putin.
In Vladimir Putin's mind, an authoritarian regime that cracks down on its country was preferable to the chaos and unpredictability that could allow the Islamists to seize power.
It all started in 2011, the revolutions of the Arab Spring, which spread like wildfire through Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and finally Syria, worried Moscow. Putin believed that Washington had orchestrated the fall of the autocrats Ben Ali, Gaddafi, and Mubarak. leaving a gaping hole that would encourage the spread of radical Islam. This contagion needed to be stopped.
If you continue northwards, then Russia isn't far. So at a certain point, Putin said, look, we need to bring an end to all this regime change. Otherwise, our American friends will go too far. That's the reason he intervened, to bring an end to Western regime change policy.
To everyone's surprise, on September 30th, 2015, Russian forces joined the action alongside those of Bashar al-Assad. Putin was provoking the United States in the Middle East.
The military operation in Syria came as a surprise. Nobody expected Russia to be there with such a strong force. At the time, it was the first post-Soviet operation to be carried out by Russia outside of its near abroad.
Putin struck from the sky. A deluge of steel and fire that hit rebels and civilians indiscriminately. For ground combat, Moscow called on mercenaries. Since the trauma of the war in Afghanistan, the death of Russian soldiers could harm public opinion. So for this hybrid war, discretion was of the essence.
It's very advantageous for a state to carry out hybrid warfare, to send in hybrid troops, whether that's in eastern Ukraine or Syria. Hybridity is when a state fulfills its functions, but without anyone being personally responsible.
At Hemimim Air Base in Syria, a Putin poster said it all. Russia's borders stop nowhere. To keep the budget of his conquests as low as possible, the Kremlin boss could count on the mysterious figure of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Nicknamed Putin's chef, he got rich by supplying the kitchens of the Kremlin and the Russian army, a contract that made him a billionaire. In Moscow, Novaya Gazeta, one of the few existing investigative newspapers, despite pressure from on high and the murder of 6 of its journalists, led an inquiry into Yevgeny Prigozhin. An oligarch and businessman, he is also the man secretly behind the Wagner Group, a private military contractor that hires out mercenaries for Kremlin interests, and this time made available to Bashar al-Assad. Mercenaries paid with money from Syrian oil.
He's a very mysterious, very shady character, and he revels in that. He revels in being able to attack where he likes, while saying, it's nothing to do with me. Where's the proof that these are my men? It's a new form of Russian honesty. They carry on doing what they want, threatening people. And then they say, go on, try proving that it's us. Where's the proof? Is there enough evidence to indict us? What are you talking about? What so-called chef? You've got to be kidding.
Значит, давайте начнем с Вагнера и с поваров. Значит, все мои повара – сотрудники Федеральной службы охраны. Они люди военные, в разных званиях находятся. Других поваров у меня нет. Надо, чтобы было это ясно, понятно, и чтобы мы к этому не возвращались. Значит, если вот эта группа Вагнера что-то нарушает, тогда Генеральная прокуратура должна дать правовую оценку. Теперь по поводу присутствия их где-то там за границей. Но если, повторяю еще раз, они не нарушают российского закона, они вправе работать, продавливать свои бизнес-интересы в любой точке планеты.
Move along. There's nothing to see. At the Duma, which authorized the military intervention, parliamentarians preferred to turn a blind eye. After 2 years of fighting, Putin had managed to consolidate his ally Bashar al-Assad's regime, which the Americans and Europeans had believed condemned. And in the meantime, the master tactician also strengthened his own positions. The port of Tartus and the Hemimim Air Base guaranteed a permanent Russian presence and access to the Mediterranean. Heavy-fisted diplomacy, coupled with guileful entente with the Turkish, Iranian, Saudi, and Israeli players in the region. At Hemimim Air Base, accompanied by the obligatory Bashar al-Assad, Putin the war leader came to celebrate victory and congratulate his troops.
Товарищи, самое главное для военного человека, и мы с вами это хорошо знаем, это защита своего отечества, своего народа. Здесь созданы и на постоянной основе будут действовать два пункта базирования в Тартусе и здесь, в Мимиме. И если террористы вновь поднимут голову, то мы нанесем им такие удары, которых они пока и не видели.
After creating the strategic surprise of entering the war in Syria, the West started speaking about him again. They sought him out and involved him in talks about the future of the region and beyond. One well-known expert in Russia described this in a rather brutal way. Since we dropped bombs on Syria, the West is talking to us again.
Bismarck said, diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. In the ruins of Palmyra, freed from ISIS hands, Putin, the war chief and chief orchestrator of victory, celebrated his triumph with music.
It was an incredible achievement for Putin, because the former Soviet Union had never had so many friends in the Middle East. But now, Russia had become a must-have player in all talks and peace settlements in the region.
Both Shiites and Sunnis saluted their Russian partner. Hassan Rouhani of Iran and Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, and even Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. Putin had won the respect of the Middle East, where until then, the United States had been the master. With further jubilatory provocation, in 2020, he was invited to Damascus to celebrate victory and Christmas.
On an international level, Russia's intervention in Syria showed everybody that there was one leader in the world who was ready to take responsibility, who had his beliefs, who had his friends, and who knew how to defend them.
Strengthened by his success in Syria, Putin began eyeing the Mediterranean. Libya was a lot of sand, but also a lot of oil. A unique opportunity to teach the West and the United Nations a lesson, as they were to blame, in Moscow's eyes, for the chaos in Libya.
Но вы также хорошо знаете тех, кто довел до этого состояния. Россия была против использования в Ливии вооруженных сил, и резолюция Совета Безопасности, которая была принята по этому поводу, она запрещала бывшему руководителю Ливии Каддафи применять свою авиацию в отношении оппозиционных сил, вооруженных, кстати говоря. Вместо этого западная коалиция начала применять авиацию против Ливии, грубо извратив резолюцию Совета Безопасности ООН. Все это привело к тому, что ранее практически процветавшая страна, уровень жизни в этой стране уже приближался к некоторым европейским стандартам. Теперь находится в хаосе, в полном развале, и гражданская война не прекращается.
On March 19, 2011, French, British, and American planes struck Gaddafi's troops. Their stated goal? To protect civilian populations. The West still believed it could offer peace. The West's intervention in Libya was supposed to bring democracy and prosperity. But with Gaddafi gone, all it did was create chaos. In Putin's mind, the guilty parties were obvious.
For the Russians, the entire blame lay with the West. It was the West which was guilty of trickery, betrayal and hypocrisy. These are the terms that keep coming back whenever Putin talks about the West. He constantly reminds the West of its weaknesses and incoherencies. And he knows full well how to use these to turn situations to his own advantage.
Like in Syria, Turks and Russians faced off in Libya. Russia, allied to Egypt, supported Field Marshal Haftar, who held the Oil Crescent and Cyrenaica, while Turkey backed Fayez el-Sarraj and the Government of National Accord, which held Tripolitania. Libya was a cake to be shared, a gateway into Africa, oil, and control in the Mediterranean.
There was also this inroad into the Mediterranean, the so-called Greater Mediterranean, which is not just the Mediterranean Sea and its shores, but also the Red Sea and the Black Sea and the Atlantic Ocean off Gibraltar. And here too, in the Greater Mediterranean, the Russian threat is growing.
On January 11, 2017, off the coast of Tobruk, the Russian aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov welcomed on board with full honors Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar, Putin's chosen strongman.
You need a strong man in place, a man as strong as Gaddafi was, first to rebuild the Libyan state, and then to breathe life into it. Libya needs a strong man, and I think that Field Marshal Haftar can fulfill that role. Whatever the case, a solution must be found.
On November 7, 2018, a meeting was held between Field Marshal Haftar and the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. As Haftar was greeted by the Chief of Staff, one onlooker was Yevgeny Prigozhin, the presumed boss of the mercenary firm the Wagner Group, a disturbing image which has since vanished from official archives.
You need to understand that Wagner isn't a company like any other, because it has no legal existence as such. The Wagner Group is more like a franchise made up of a large number of shell corporations. There's a whole galaxy of players and companies linked to one man, Yevgeny Prigozhin. He's the center of gravity of this entire galaxy.
In exchange for arms and extra military support, Haftar could offer oil, access to the Mediterranean Sea, and future contracts. Mouth-watering proposals. It was up to Prigozhin, present at the meeting, to provide logistics and mercenaries. Almost 2,000 Phantom Wagner Group soldiers arrived in Libya in the service of Field Marshal Haftar. The Kremlin line was categorical. Not a single Russian soldier was operational on Libyan soil. Putin could contentedly show a clean pair of hands.
All things are possible, but I don't think for a minute that Putin is a mafia godfather with guys coming in to kiss his ring. It's definitely not as patriarchal as that. However, I don't think anyone can act without his blessing.
Desert sands cover the largest oil reserves in Africa. Despite the facilities being run down or damaged by war, the share of profits from Libyan oil is key to quenching the thirsts of the Russian and Turkish godfathers.
In Libya, there are huge gains to be made. In Cyrenaica on one side, for the Russians, and on the other side, in Tripolitania for Turkey. So there's no reason to fight. Everyone can get along nicely, sharing out the spoils.
With Turkish President Recep Erdogan, the game is both violent and muffled. Neither friends nor enemies, the two pragmatic partners, Sultan and Tsar, make agreements behind the backs of the West and its allies.
Putin has no trouble understanding Erdogan. Erdogan isn't a reliable partner. But he knows that Russia isn't a reliable partner either. Let's play together, and let's have fun playing together. I know what kind of games you like. You don't need fancy trimmings like democracy and human rights. You're a tough nut, and so am I.
With Russia's borders and near abroad secured, and following a successful show of force in the Middle East, the Kremlin began looking farther afield, to Africa. In Sochi, in October 2019, an entire continent accepted the Russian president's invitation. Putin was preparing a vast safari into African markets.
Уважаемые друзья, хотел бы прежде всего поприветствовать всех участников первого саммита Россия-Африка и Российско-Африканского экономического форума. В Сочи прибыли делегации всех стран Африки. Более 40 представлены на уровне первых лиц.
The Russia-Africa summit in Sochi hit Paris like a bomb. The French government found it hard to swallow. There are 54 countries in Africa, so having 45 heads of state present was absolutely huge.
Touadéra, the contested president of the Central African Republic, needs Russian weapons to keep himself in power, while Putin needs African votes to support him within the United Nations. Russian weapons are up for sale, and they have proved their worth in Syria. It's a simple contract, military support in exchange for mining licenses for Russian companies.
In Russia, it goes like this. Hey guys, we'll sell you thousands of weapons that are tried and tested in Syria, in the desert, and in scorching heat. Is that how we're meant to turn Africa into a more peaceful continent? Oh, come on.
January 2018, the first Ilyushin landed in the Central African Republic. An arms delivery met by Valery Zakharov, President Touadéra's new Russian security advisor, a guardian angel imposed by Moscow. 30 African countries have already signed military cooperation agreements with the Kremlin. The United States no longer appears to be a reliable partner. French interventionism is bothersome, and China is worrying. So Russia is the new ideal partner. Security in exchange for business, whatever regime is in place. Putin's words sound good, so the riches of Africa are his for the taking. The bear has found his honeypot.
Russia says, okay, I come in, I won't preach to you about democracy, I'll just guarantee your security. I'll be criticized for it, but I'll do it just like the French do. I'll give your presidency a security advisor and will ensure not only your security, but will also go into the Central African Army and train up your men. And it'll all be official.
In Bokassa's ruined palace, far from prying eyes, Valery Zakharov, the background advisor, and his mercenaries are carrying out a double mission to safeguard President Touadéra's power and protect Russian interests.
An agreement was signed between the defense ministers of the Central African Republic and Russia. These men are army reserves. This isn't a private military enterprise, or a Wagner, as you suggest. These are army reserves. This is common practice. The Central African president sent out an invitation, and I agreed to become his security advisor. The president invited Russia, and Russia accepted.
Russia will never ask a state for justifications regarding human rights. Never. But it will demand shows of loyalty and mining access for its entrepreneurs. Everybody knows that the Wagner Group isn't just mercenaries helping out with the country's security. Wagner is there to ensure the security of Yevgeny Prigozhin's business interests in that country.
In 2018, Yevgeny Prigozhin obtained several mining licenses for his company Lobaye Invest. And so what if the gold and diamond deposits are in areas in rebel hands? His Wagner Group mercenaries are there to secure access to the mines. The blood diamonds, subject to embargo, are discreetly exported. The autocrat Touadéra is protected, Prigozhin is getting rich, and Putin has a solid foothold in Africa on the cheap. A win-win deal.
Gaining a foothold like that in Central Africa, which has traditionally been a French sphere of geopolitical influence, can definitely be seen as Russia thumbing its nose at a French presence in the region, or as a threat to French strategic interests, no doubt about it.
In late 2016, the French troops, which had come to bring a halt to civil war, left the country mission unaccomplished. A godsend for Zakharov, Prigozhin, and their men. In Paris, people started to worry about the Russian presence.
Il y a une présence active de la Russie, récente, significative, anti-française. Wagner, c'est des supplétifs, c'est pas vraiment l'armée, c'est des supplétifs qui agissent sous l'autorité d'un monsieur qui s'appelle monsieur Prigozhin. Et s'il m'entend là, au-delà de cette salle, qu'il sache qu'on le connaît bien. Voilà.
If an opponent has a weakness, you have to exploit it. And Russia is tempted, has a strong desire to hoist its flag in whichever places it can.
In the skies and on the walls of Bangui, the new Russian-African friendship is praised. Kalashnikovs have won peace and Moscow local hearts, a highly effective exercise in soft power. Financed by the Russian mining company Lobaye Invest, bush hospitals, radios, and movie screens tell of the benevolence of a new brother, the Russian bear. A tale of the misadventures of the animals of the savannah who see their land pillaged by greedy hyenas.
L'ours, d'un pays lointain du Nord, qui s'appelle la Russie, et s'est rendu sur le lieu et de son ami. Ils ne pouvaient pas rester indifférents, parce qu'ils sont amis depuis très longtemps et doivent s'aider l'un l'autre.
The interesting thing here is that it's not just about bad guys pillaging natural resources. There's a whole lot of staging that's gone into it. That of this bear come to free the Central African people from French neo-colonial oppression. That's the real story being told.
Il faut établir la paix, sinon rien ne pourra aider. Ainsi, les animaux sages se sont réunis pour négocier.
The beauties of Bangui are admired by Zakharov and the Russian contingent. They have won peace where the French had failed. But the methods and rules weren't the same.
And the moral of the story is, we can all live together in peace as long as it's under the benevolent eye of the bear.
On July 29, 2018, 3 Russian journalists, Kirill Radchenko, Alexander Rastuguyev, and Orkan Jemal, were murdered. Having come to investigate the activities of the Wagner Group, the local authorities claimed they were the victims of highwaymen or rebel groups, a version approved by the Kremlin.
I believe that those mercenaries who are under Mr. Zakharov's orders and in charge of the Central African president's security suddenly feared they would discover that under the cover of ensuring the protection of the president, or rather dictator, there was a great deal of scheming going on, linked to political and economic interests. That was why our colleagues died.
Ваши коллеги, насколько мне известно, приехали в Африку без всякого уведомления местных властей. Они просто не приехали даже не как журналисты, они приехали как туристы. И по имеющимся данным на сегодняшний день покушение совершили какие-то местные группировки.
For Moscow, simply a sad crime carried out on 3 imprudent journalists. Independent investigations pointed to an ambush carried out by professionals. End of story. In Bangui, soldiers now parade singing in Russian. Far from Africa, on the doorstep of the Russian Empire, when Erdogan sent support to Azerbaijan for its capture of Armenian-backed Karabakh, Moscow began to worry. But Grand Master Putin would stop the Turkish advance and sign for a Russian return to the Caucasus. And too bad if it meant losing its Armenian ally.
Of course, we were expecting everyone to come our aid in many ways. And because we thought that there are many countries who have interests here. And probably Russia more so because it's in Russians' direct influence, this region, and it is geographically also the closest. We always considered Russians to be our friends. They did come. They came a bit late.
Azerbaijan launched Operation Iron Fist on September 27, 2020. With its oil riches and with support from Turkey, which supplied combat drones, technology, military advisors, and Syrian mercenaries, the Azeri forces forced Armenia to surrender within 45 days of fighting.
Putin simply let things unfold, and, one might suspect, with a degree of compliance or even encouragement. And at a certain point, when Russia thought that the Azerbaijan troops had gained enough ground and that the lesson had been learned, he blew the whistle for the end of the match.
A dramatic end for the Armenians. In Stepanakert, the de facto capital of the Mountain Republic, they buried their dead. More than 5,000 victims, the young generation wiped out. Once attached to Azerbaijan, the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, peopled by Armenians, declared its independence in 1991 when the USSR collapsed. A republic that Baku dreamed of retaking. Turks and Azeris wanted a complete victory and to chase out the Armenians from Karabakh. But Putin, acting as referee, imposed a ceasefire and sent in his own men.
And so, at the end of that war, Russia finally gained direct or indirect control of the South Caucasus.
2,000 Russian soldiers, 90 tanks, and several hundred vehicles entered Karabakh. Their mission? To step in between Armenian and Azeri lines. Soldiers of peace retaking, on behalf of Putin, possession of the Caucasus, left behind at the fall of the Soviet Union.
Once again, Russia imposed itself as the country that brings security and peace. And so far, successfully in Karabakh.
In Stepanakert, the Armenian capital of Karabakh, the soldiers patrolling the streets wear Russian uniforms and fly the Russian flag. It's an occupation, but also protection. Here, Azeris and Turks are mortal enemies. The message from Moscow is reassuring. Wherever there are Russian soldiers, there is peace. Armenian and Azeri positions face each other under the control of Russia, a guardian of peace defending its own interests.
It's not in Vladimir Putin's interest for Erdogan to gain a foothold in the Caucasus. Turkish activism among Turkish-speaking peoples close to our borders, and even within them, is of great concern to Russia.
The atmosphere was glacial on January 11, 2021, when Azeri President Ilham Aliyev and Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan were summoned to the Kremlin. On the agenda, the application of the ceasefire agreement. Turkey, which had enabled an Azeri victory, wasn't invited. A clear message to Erdogan. The Caucasus remains Russian. Now a major string puller in Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Africa, and the Caucasus, Putin has affirmed Russia's return to international affairs. Nobody can predict the next crack into which the bear will slip his paw. As Putin explained to a journalist, there is no turning back. Nobody can ignore Russia.
По сравнению с вами, да, так и есть. Мы белые и пушистые. Мы услышали ваше заверение о том, что НАТО не будет развиваться на восток. Но вы не выполнили своих обещаний. Но вы же умные люди. Почему вы считаете, что мы придурки? Почему вы считаете, что мы не можем таких элементарных вещей анализировать и смотреть на них?
Hubris, vanity, and Western contempt had reawakened the former narcissism of Russia, risking the start of a new Cold War.
In February 2007, at the Munich Conference on Security, Vladimir Putin sent a warning to the West, and notably to the United States. But I don't think it was heeded at the time. Many people thought he was simply in a bad mood and did not pay much attention to what he said. But 14 years later, it remains fundamental to understanding President Putin's reasoning.
The commemoration of the Great Patriotic War, a victory held sacred and celebrated by a reunited country. On May 9th, 2021, on Red Square, Putin didn't celebrate peace, but victory.
Россия последовательно отстаивает международное право. При этом мы будем твердо защищать наши национальные интересы, обеспечивать безопасность нашего народа. Надежные гарантии тому доблестные вооруженные силы России, наследники солдат Победы. Слава народу-победителю! С праздником вас! С Днем Великой Победы! Ура!
He acts like the leader of the gang, like in his childhood, which is often mentioned in biographies, where he had to act the tough guy so he wouldn't get punched. And he's transferred this quality into the political arena. The West is scared of Putin. Not of the Russian economy, which can never compare to those of Germany, the United States, or the European Union. But they're all scared of Vladimir Putin. That's your fault. Good job.
International sanctions, a fragile economy, shady affairs, and a Russian society yet to totally give up on democracy have all been unable to halt the rise of Vladimir Putin. Deep in the taiga, the Russian bear, which we couldn't have left undisturbed, is wide awake and back in the dance.
These days, before getting involved in any situation, the West looks over its shoulder and wonders if Vladimir Putin's there, how he'll react and what he'll do.